short introduction, Alex. I have a feeling that you don't require that long an introduction, but you're from California.
I don't deserve one.
I definitely do, but time is short, so we'll do it short. But you come from California, where you live. Thank you for traveling to Denmark. I know you're not only here to visit us, but we are thankful anyways. You are a manager and researcher of the global 4-day week that is a non-profit devoted to advancing the 4-day work week. Then you are an author of 4 books. One of them, as you all receive as a present today, is called in English, Rest, in Danish, Pause. I was privileged enough to get the Danish manuscript before it was printed and have an opinion about it. And I was very happy to have an opinion about it because I think it's an excellent book. And yeah, my statement is printed on the back, and of course I'm very proud of that. In the bottom of the book, in Danish, it says, high performers tips til et produktivt og afslappet liv. And that is what I was hoping to talk to you about today, to get all the tips and tricks, like get the introduction to it, because it is a long book, it's a very good book, and we can't manage to talk about it all today, and it's not the purpose. But hopefully we will inspire you all to go home and read the book afterwards. I will definitely recommend you to, at least. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks very much. No, it's great to be here, and thank you all for coming out.
It's out, you say, all Americans say out, like we would say in, that's great. Okay, first of all, before we dive into rest, as the topic of today's conversation, I want to ask you about what is the state of the 4-day work week in, like, internationally? Like in Denmark, it sure feels that we have traction, a lot of new companies coming in, but how is it in the world?
It is, I've been studying the movement for 4 or 5 years now, and it is, I think we're kind of at an inflection point with it. The pandemic did, first of all, I think it created a demand for sort of ways of working or relationships between work and life that are sort of more balanced than what we had in 2019. But I think it also showed us that it's actually possible for people and companies to change how they work faster and more profoundly than we ever thought possible, right? To move to work from home in a matter of weeks, right? When some bosses would have thought this is, that their companies could never do this. And so I think that it's both increased the appetite and sort of opened up the possibility of finding new ways of working. And so more companies are now interested in and experimenting with the 4-day week as sort of a result of those experiences.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to hear a talk from you this Monday, and you talked about the experiment in the very big experiment that they're doing in UK. Mm-hmm. Could you just briefly tell us a bit about that? How is that going?
Sure. So this involves about 70 companies, which range from a craft brewery to nonprofits to a robotics firm. And midway through, we did a survey of companies, and we found that more than half of them reported that productivity was as good or better than it had been when they were working 5 days. That, not surprisingly, people were happier, they felt more engaged with their work, and interestingly, they were sleeping on average an hour longer during the 4-day week than they had been before, which is, for all kinds of reasons, really terrific. And I think 95% of them expect to be able to make it full-time after the trial is over at the beginning of the new year.
For me, I think it's super good news, and also it's like work smart, not harder. It's a very solid proof that rethink the way we do stuff that pays off. Good. Then fly in, it says on my paper here, like directing us back to the topic, rest. First of all, like what inspired you, what motivated you to write a book about rest?
So I have always been interested in creativity. I mean, literally the first class I took in college was about the psychology of creativity. And in a way, this is finally the paper I should have written. sort of 30 years ago. But what really got me thinking about this particular version was about 10 years ago, I had a sabbatical at Microsoft Research in Cambridge. And I live in Silicon Valley. It's the world's capital of overwork, and we're very proud of that. And about halfway through my sabbatical, I realized that I was getting an enormous amount of stuff done, but I was also sort of having a lot of free time, but at the same time writing a lot, having great ideas. And it made me wonder that maybe, sort of at this point when I was doing some of the best work of my life, that maybe our assumptions about the relationship between work or time and accomplishment, the assumption that the world feeds us, that overwork is sort of a kind of necessary precondition for doing good work, and that it is inevitable and inescapable, that maybe that's actually completely, not just completely wrong, but backwards. That in order to do really, to do work that you're really passionate about, it's necessary to both work hard, but to recognize the value of rest in helping you, in helping us accomplish what we want, and so that experience started me on a path of looking at the lives of very accomplished people, Nobel Prize winners, famous writers, composers, and stuff, and also looking into the neuroscience and psychology of creativity to try to understand how the daily lives and practices of those people might have some scientific explanation or justification. And I began to see that stuff aligned, as I explain in the book, and at that point I realized there's actually a really interesting story here worth telling.
Yeah.
So.
First of all, I would like to get the definition right. Like, what do you actually mean with rest? In the book, you call it deliberate rest or aktive pauser. Could you just explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So, we often think of rest as kind of what you do sitting on a couch with, like a beer in one hand and a remote in the other. It's something that's entirely passive. It takes very little energy. But it turns out that the most restorative kinds of rest are, for one thing, generally pretty active, that we are better recharge the mental and physical batteries that we drain working, doing things like exercise or walks or engaging in hobbies. I think another important element of rest is that it turns out it's actually kind of a skill. It's something that we can learn to do. It's natural, but it's something that we can actually get better at over time. It's a little bit like breathing, right? We all know how to breathe, but if you're an athlete or a singer, you learn how to use your breath to get more energy or to project to the back of the auditorium. And so I think that recognizing that work and rest in really good lives, accomplished lives, are not competitors, but rather can be partners, and that we can design ways of working, daily routines and so on, that allow us, allow them to support and to sustain each other. So.
Yeah. In a moment, I'll ask you to tell us more about the science about rest, around rest. But I think the problem with today's idea about rest is that it's like somebody fleeing from work, right? Mm-hmm. And you call it partners, and I think that is a very good a way of explaining it. That in order for you to actually do really good work, you also have to do really good rest. Yeah. And rest is not just rest, right? Yeah. But tell us a little bit more about the science of rest.
Sure. So
how does it work? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think probably many of us are familiar with work that tells us about the value of sleep, for example, or the long-term benefits of sports or exercise or other kinds of physical activity. And if you don't, briefly, more sleep, more physical activity means that you're healthier, you have better mental and physical health, you're likely not only to live longer, but to age better. So, as well as sort of having more immediate benefits in terms of being able to sort of work better or be a better person. But there's been some really exciting research in the last 20 or so years looking at the role that sort of mental rest periods play in sort of learning and in creativity. And the big lessons here, I think, are that, first of all, when we go through when you kind of relax your mind and think about nothing at all, kind of zone out, as we say in English, it feels like our brains are sort of calming down, but in fact they're not. Some of our most active sort of mental periods are when we allow our minds to kind of wander and to think about whatever they want. And indeed, it is in these periods that sort of our brains activate what scientists call a default mode network, which connects different parts of the brain that are associated with memory, with creativity, often with sort of spatial thinking. And this is important because it turns out rest periods are important for doing things like consolidating new ideas or new memories, moving them into sort of long-term memory. But it's also important because those are the periods often when our creative subconscious are able to take on ideas or questions that we have not been able to solve through conscious effort, to continue working on them, and then to generate solutions without us having to kind of think about them. This is something that happens just multiple times a day. So you're trying to remember the name of the actor who is in the movie and that other thing, and you can't remember, and then you're doing something else, and 5 minutes later, it pops into your head. That's the default mode network continuing to solve a problem even while you're doing something else. And one of the things that really creative people do is arrive at working schedules and routines that maximize the amount of time that their creative minds have for that kind of activity, which is you can never command those sorts of insights, but it turns out you can create conditions in which they're more likely to happen, which is part of what makes the difference between having good ideas and having breakthrough ideas.
Yeah, because rest is not just rest, right? You already talked briefly about it, that like sitting on the couch with a beer is not like necessarily the best way to actually rest. Could you talk about different types of rest?
Which is not to say that there's anything wrong with that, or if I do a certain amount of it myself, but it's not all that it's all that rest is. So I think that that there is quite a personal dimension to it. I think that in the book I talk about people who are avid walkers, some who are Olympic level athletes. Niels Bohr and his brother were both surprisingly good athletes, given given our our assumptions that that scientists and mathematicians are kind of nerdy people who stay indoors. But I think that many highly creative people find that not only is that a great and necessary break from work, but that it also also enhances their stamina for work and their capacity for it. But I think that one of the things that we have to do in life is to figure out what kinds of practices, what sorts of hobbies or physical activities are the ones that are most restorative for us, that fit into our lives, and that really provide the sort of satisfaction that will let us do them regularly, even as we have all kinds of other things clamoring for our attention.
Yeah. In the book, you write about deep play.
Yeah.
What is deep play?
So, one of the interesting things in many of these biographies is there are people who have hobbies that take a lot of time, they're physically dangerous, they're demanding, and so why is it that people who are very ambitious would also invest in things that seem to be that seem to take them away from work. And what it turns out is that people who are really passionate and sometimes a little obsessed about their work can't just, it's really hard to just kind of switch off and do nothing. What you need is something else that is just as interesting and in its way just as rewarding as your work. And so people who do this successfully will find hobbies that offer some of the same kinds of psychological satisfactions or rewards as their work, but in a different kind of context. Usually it's a very physical thing, especially if they're doing a lot of cognitive work, and it delivers those rewards fairly quickly. So a great example is scientists who are mountain climbers, and they talk about climbing as being like doing science, right? You have this big goal, you're engaging with nature. It's a big problem that you break down into a lot of simple steps, and at the end of the day, you've either reached the top or you haven't. Whereas when you're doing an experiment, it might last for a year, and maybe it'll succeed and maybe it won't. But executives who also are mountain climbers will talk about climbing as like being an executive, right? It's leadership, you have a team, you have to motivate people, get people to push past their limits. It's the same activity, but you zero in on different parts of it that make it important for you. And so, but if you can find these, it can help you, it can be great as sort of another channel for channel for your energies and source of satisfaction that can remind you of what you love best, kind of about not just your work, but about your life when it goes really well, and provide a degree of balance and resilience as well. So that's what deep play is.
Yeah. Talking about the sofa again, I think that many of us can recognize the situation where we come home from work, and then maybe if we haven't deleted the app yet, start scrolling on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, God forbid it, something like that, and you get absorbed in it. Like, how would that look in an MRI scanner, for example?
It looks less like rest than you would think. I mean, in the sense that, for one thing, when you're on social media, your brain treats it more like interacting with other people than, let's say, if you're playing Mario Kart, just to take an example from my own life. It's also the case that these are platforms that are consciously trying to capture and commodify your attention. And so it is different, cognitively different from, let's say, walking in the park, in that you may focus on one thing 1 second and your kind of eyes move to something else. Your mind doesn't have to go any particular place, which is part of the beauty of it. Whereas if you're on Facebook, Mark really wants you to notice this ad and preferably to click on that ad. So it's not about allowing your mind to go where it wants. It is your mind up against 100 Stanford behavioral science PhDs who have engineered every single pixel to get the result that they want. That's the difference.
Yeah, and the dark side of what we do, maybe. Yeah. So that's the difference of.
No offense.
Oh, no,
I mean,
none taken.
This can be used for good, by the way. These powers, so.
We are trying to take responsibility here by giving out books, stuff like that.
Exactly.
But it's like it's the different like real rest. You turn your mind inwards, so to say. In like the cognition is turned inwards instead of outwards. And the problem with social media, for example, is that even though you feel like you are resting now, you're lying down on the sofa, you're resting, your attention is still directed outwards. So you won't get the benefit of the default mode network working for you, right. Make you more creative. Like when you start working again after the period of rest, you will not have that benefit.
Right. No. Yeah. Distraction and the default mode are two different things. Yeah. Distraction is often your attention being captured by something else. The default mode is your mind just kind of floating around and doing its thing.
Yeah. And I think that's super cool, and I think that also that changed my perception of rest. When I learned that my mind is actually working for me when I rest, if I just rest the right way, and that is super cool because then it's not fleeing from work or just a relief. It is actually enhancing my performance afterwards, making me more creative. Yeah. In the book, there's also a whole chapter about napping. I really enjoyed reading that. Should we all start taking naps while we're working hours?
You know, the fact that we don't nap today, we're living in a period that is the historical exception rather than the rule, right? For most of history, humans would nap in the middle of the day. And indeed, in even in early factories where, you had shifts that were 12 or 14 hours long, you would have in the middle of the day, lunch and then a nap, picking this up from sort of rhythms of agricultural life. And it's only recently that naps ceased to be something that we did at work. And so I think that every single one of us has that experience of, that early afternoon slump after lunch where we're trying, especially if we're in a meeting, to push through and actually, just stay awake. And it would be better for everybody if, you could grab even just a 20-minute nap in that period, right? 20 minutes is enough generally to sort of restore you about as much as a serious cup of coffee does. And having permission to do that is would I think make companies better places and get better workers and actually also get healthier workers too.
All right. I read in your book that there is a difference in both at which time you take the nap and for how long the nap lasts. And that it can be designed, that you can design your nap to spark different things. For example, if you want restitution, you need to do it in a certain time of day. If you want more creativity, it's a different time of day. Right. That is very interesting, I think.
It is. It's not something that's kind of napping 201. It's the more advanced version. And honestly, for myself, even though I do this regularly, I just take a nap when I get tired. Right? I'm not trying to hack it for sort of for a particular result. I figure my body knows what it wants. However, people who study this do find that if you understand your own sort of circadian rhythm, you can kind of time naps or even just rest periods where you don't completely fall asleep, so that you get more of a physical restorative benefit, or you get more of a mental and creative boost, much in the same way that in a sleep cycle, the 90-minute cycle when we're asleep, there are parts of the cycle or parts of the night that are more attuned to physical restoration, right? Our brains cleaning out plaques and so forth, and then other parts that are about consolidating memories, or the parts where we're dreaming, which tend to happen later, later at night. So if you can do that, great. But personally, I would say there is no such thing as a bad nap or a nap that's wasted time.
Very good advice, I think. Okay, so yeah, now we know that rest is crucial to our performance, and we know that rest isn't just rest. And that the different types of rest that can do different things to us. Restitution, make us more creative. But I think that the problem with knowledge is that we are humans, we know it, but it's very hard to apply it. So before I wrap this interview up, I want to ask you about if you have any tips and tricks, maybe pull from all the cases you have in the books about how to make it operational, how to build it into your everyday life.
Right. So we already talked about deep play, so I want to highlight two other things. One is that there is a fairly clear kind of routine that that very creative people tend to sort of gravitate towards. And that involves, working generally about 4 or 5 really intensive hours sort of per day, and then layering along with that periods of deliberate rest. So we can generally focus really hard on something for about 90 to 110 minutes before our brains start to fry and we need to sort of get up and take a break. So the more that you can design into your day periods where you can really dive deep, right? Undistracted periods where you can focus seriously, and then immediately have a break where you don't have to really think about very much at all, and then another deep dive, and then another break. And if you can do that twice consistently, that's a really good day. You can actually get an awful lot done, an awful lot of progress on really serious projects in those with that kind of rhythm. To make it more potent, you can play around with what time of day this happens. So lots of people will get up super early to do this. So if your life allows starting that first phase at 6 in the morning, then like Ernest Hemingway or Charles Darwin, then or Toni Morrison, that's awesome. But 2 concentrated hours any time of day are going to be better than 4 semi-distracted hours. I think the other thing is focus on making those work periods more intensive. Cal Newport calls this deep work. So think about making the deep work deeper rather than trying to stretch it out longer during the day. Not only does that give you better results, but it's also more sustainable. I think we all reach a point in our lives where we probably had worked super long hours and it just starts to become physically difficult. It's also, if you're good at what you do, becomes less necessary. And so better to pursue a strategy of figuring out how to get more deep work. The other thing that I would say is that these routines, we can develop these as best we can by ourselves, but it's really super powerful if we can do this with other people. And this is one of the things that makes me really passionate about the 4-day week movement, is that companies that move to 4-day weeks often are introducing into their daily schedules and introducing into their work cultures norms that that encourage people not just to take periods of for deep work, but to do so together. Right? Giving everyone 2 hours a day to do this sort of thing can be great, because you don't have to worry in that period about whether you are, whether your colleagues think you're antisocial, or are you missing, is there other stuff you ought to be doing when everyone is doing it together. There's also some evidence. You remember when you're studying for finals and you go to the library, you're not working with anybody else, but being in the presence of other people who concentrate often helps us concentrate. This is actually a real thing. And so, to the degree that we are able to make this, to embed this in cooperative practices, or make it something that we do with other people, rather than something we have to kind of steal from the world or steal from our workplaces, the better off we're going to be. So.
Cool, very operational. In your book, you have a lot of fantastic stories about Nobel Prize winners, famous authors. You mentioned a couple of them already. And describing their routines and their methods to accomplish what they did. And I think that the thing is that a lot of them actually didn't work that hard. If we compare it to how we work today, they didn't work that many hours, and definitely not that intense, and they had a lot of resting periods. What is your favorite story among all those?
I think my favorite probably is the naturalist Charles Darwin. Partly, before I got into this research, I was a historian of science, and so Darwin was someone who I studied. But in addition to doing the stuff that we already talked about, Darwin discovers these patterns in maybe his late 30s or his early 40s. And he moves from London, which is full of distractions, out into the country. He buys a place where he can actually build a path that he goes walking on every afternoon. He calls it his thinking path. But for me, not only is he a great embodiment of all the stuff that is key in the book, but the fact that the first 30 plus years of his life, he works in a very different kind of way, right? He's got kids, so he's up really late, and so this is making him really tired, and he's about to burn out. Shows us that even incredibly smart people at first are kind of stupid about how they work, right? We develop these bad habits, and they work just well enough for us to keep, to keep practicing them, and we see everybody else doing them, and so we think, yeah, this is how work is done. The other important thing is that it shows it's never too late to adopt this, right? I think, I only discovered this when I was about 40 or so, right? Maybe, yeah, let's say. And that's, so if you're at that stage, kind of midway in your career, the things that you've been doing, you kind of feel like don't work as well for you, and you feel like there ought to be something better. It's not that it's not too late to find new ways of working. In fact, you're probably right on time.
Yeah. So hope for everyone here. Yeah. In a minute. I've been very good at keeping the time this time. I just want to say, I would like you to ask Alex some questions, whatever is on your mind. So start preparing. But first, what is your own routine?
My own routine. Well, with 4-day week global is genuinely global, and so I don't quite work 4-day weeks because I'm off. My day often starts with, Zoom calls to Europe at 6 in the morning and ends with calls to Asia at 6 p.m. So, however, in the middle of the day, there's usually a big block of time where I spend with the dogs. I take a long nap very often. I do the other things that I talk about in the book. So, I think I've gotten it probably down to about a 30 or 32 hour week. So the equivalent of about 4 days, just spread out a little bit differently.
Okay, thank you. So, questions. Raise your hands and wait for a microphone because we really want to have your questions on the video. And the cameras can pick it up if you go.
Over here first, over here. And then there was someone here, and then 3.
Thank you. It's really inspiring. My name is Sita. I work as a work-life consultant in one of the bigger trade unions here in Denmark. So my whole field is around how to create a better work-life balance. And I have followed also 4-day work weeks with many companies for some time. And what I see is that mostly if a 4-day work week is introduced with active focus on how you can make, for instance, good breaks and a good structure and the right kind of restitution, then it's really a benefit for both the employer and the employees. However, many companies, they just rush on and they introduce a 4-day work week and they forget about all the other stuff, and it becomes actually difficult because you will not really obtain the results, and you will not really also get, the employers will also not benefit from it. So it's not really the win-win that you want it to be. So just to say that it's good to hear how you have also in Abtion really tried to introduce it with focus on this. I think unfortunately many people or many companies just rush it through. But my question is more about around the restitution, because as I hear you're talking about different kinds of restitution, the sleep nap, maybe also mindfulness or yoga or whatever belongs to that category. And then there's another category which is more like active restitution, a walk or a jogging, or I dance flamenco, for instance, so something like that, I guess. But then I'm interested in that thing in the middle. So I think those two things that I just mentioned probably should be a balance, right? You cannot only do the active restitution because you do need to sleep and rest and things like that. But the middle thing or whatever, the other thing about, I don't know, social media and Netflix in the sofa or whatever, what does that, how, how does that fit into the whole picture of restitution and the balance between active, passive rest?
Well, I think that there definitely are kinds of rest that can be, sort of mentally engaging, sort of rewarding, without being as physical, right? There, sort of, this is, people who are serious amateur painters, or like my wife, who is a really devoted sort of quilter. And we have 7 sewing machines in the house, and every one of them has a particular purpose, and I don't understand them, but you need them when you make quilts. But but things of that sort can be sort of just are in their ways just as active forms of rest, in the sense of offering that level of engagement and restitution that I think characterizes sort of rest at its at its finest. And then I think that a person, as someone who has accounts with several streaming services, I will sort of say that the big thing to sort of recognize is that it's not like there's anything wrong with this. I just finally finished Squid Games, but it's not the only kind of rest that we should pursue. So that's really the important thing. There was a second question over here, and then the third person had her hand up over here. And I'm sorry for taking over the process, but anyway.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I come from the company Brugt, who works with behavior, communication, and organization. And I was wondering also about this restitution. For me, there's a difference between, within psychology, I was taught that it's called incubation time, when you're thinking about something without really thinking about it, but your brain just continues. And that was, for instance, when I do the dishes by hand, and my brain just thinks of everything else. But I actually do rock climb, and when I do that, my brain doesn't think at all. That's the feeling I have. So for me, there's a difference between those two things. What is an active rest? Is it both of them? Is it when my brain is just wandering around and I go along but I don't control it? Or is it the kind of flow you get into when you're not really thinking at all?
That's, I think we need to better understand the relationship between mind wandering and flow states. We do experience them as somewhat different kinds of things, and both of them are incredibly valuable. And indeed, Csikszentmihalyi argued that flow was not just something that was pleasurable, but was essential to sort of our fulfillment as people and sort of to having good lives, right? It's not just about reaching level 40 on a video game. So I think, and I think that especially in an era of super distraction, the ability to having activities that sort of that allow us to fall into that is extremely valuable. I do. There is, however, the question is that kind of default mode that's sort of turning over ideas still at work when we're in those flow states? And the answer is maybe it is at this point. I mean, there's still an awful lot of stuff that we don't we don't know about how all of this works. But I think fundamentally, if you take one thing away, is that if this if this works for you, then if this kind of rest works for you, or to pursue it, you are ultimately your own best judge if you trust yourself of what you need and and what's going to benefit you most. Over here.
Hello. Thank you, both of you, both Alex and Bo, for a very inspiring talk. I have a question regarding entrepreneurship and the principles of 4-day work week. I have a small company myself, and I'm working a lot with entrepreneurs. And in Denmark, we have this, in my opinion, a terrible program called Løvens Hule. I don't know what the English... Dragon's Den, okay. But the whole idea of this show is that people pitching their companies to get funding, yes. And the whole storyline is that if you're not working 80 or 100 hours a week, you're not serious about your business. You're not committed enough in order to pursue, you're not serious enough. Anyways, what are your experiences, and you can answer, both of you, in regards to designing new companies around these principles? I really try to follow them myself in my company, but my dad is also always asking, okay, so how is it going with the company? Are you working full time? And I'm like, I try not to. But so maybe do you have anything to share about giving advice to small companies or startups and stuff like that around the 4-day work week?
You want to take this?
Yes. Believe in it, because it is the smart way. Like, more input doesn't make more output. And it's just the same with rest, and I just talked to Alex about it before we started here, is that what I think this book does very good is that it convinces you that it actually works, because you will often doubt it when you're like, okay, I have an important assignment. I could really do with a nap now, really need a nap, or I could really need a walk or a run or something like that. And then you have like the tendency to like, okay, no, I need to continue, I need to finish it. Where the best thing, also for the result and the time you would be able to actually deliver a result in, would be to follow that need and believe in it. And I think that that's the thing we did in Abtion. It is counterintuitive to reduce your time to produce more, but it works.
I would give, as a quick follow-on, the example of a startup in New York called Cockroach Labs. And Cockroach was founded by several ex-Google guys. Also, they'd been at Square, and they wanted to take Google's famous 20% time, which was kind of a myth, and actually make, build it into their schedules. And Cockroach Labs does cloud-based SQL databases. I don't know what these are, but apparently people who do cloud stuff and do SQL stuff say it's really exciting to put these together, whatever. But what one of the founders told me was that, this is actually a really tough set of technical problems. And when you are if you're trying to work on something for 14 hours a day, by about hour 8, you're starting to just grind metal, and you're just going to look at the screen and try the same things over and over again. And it's far better if you're doing, basically work as serious as we are doing here at Cockroach Labs. You need to give your mind time to recover and trust that, all these years of experience you have solving problems has settled down into your brain enough so that essentially your mind is going to solve these problems for you. I think it was Ernst Mach who said that he had some of his best ideas when he was out climbing, out walking. And he said he hated to admit it, but his subconscious mind was a better mathematician than he was, because it could come up with ideas that he could never solve on his own. And so they implemented a 4-day week from day one. not only have they done apparently really good work, but it also means that they're able to, as a startup without a huge amount of money, were able to attract a level of talent. People who never would have thought of going to work for a startup. People like in their late 30s and 40s, and you've got kids, and the idea of doing another 12-hour day thing is not as interesting to you, but doing, sort of kind of flipping the bit and saying, okay, can I apply all the stuff that I've learned to do great work in 4 days? That's actually an interesting challenge for me. And I'm willing to, accept a lower salary for that. And as of their last, their last VC raise, they were worth about $2.5 billion or so. So there is nothing necessarily incompatible with working a 4-day week and having, huge technical goals or great success as a company. You just got to believe in it, like you said.
One more question. And
thank you. I just want to comment on what you said about the 4-day work week and your dad asking you, are you working full time? And so my dad, who's a very old man, he told me when he was working in UK in the 50s, this at the office, when they were working, they were talking golf, and when they were playing golf, they were talking work. I think that says a lot about it, because I don't know about the magic about the 4-day work week. I think it's about having those rest, as you talk about, and listen to your body and saying, now I need a rest, and then perhaps on a Sunday you will work because you spark an idea and then you pursue it. And I think you are able to do that when you have started your own company. So I think it's a much more natural way of working, like people were doing before there were big companies. So I think we will be going away from being big companies and being a lot of individuals who are cooperating. And then it's Sunday or Monday or whatever day it is, you rest or you work as applicable. Thank you.
yeah, it's about like looking at what are you doing and what are the best terms to actually do that. Analyze them, think about it, be smart. Yeah. So, thank you very much, Alex.
Thank
you
you.
for good questions.
Thank you all. Great questions, too.
Og vi skal jo gøre, som vi prædiker. Så nu tager vi en pause på 10 minutter, og så gå op og få noget at drikke, og gå ud og få lidt luft.